that. Hey, if we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Justin Chandler. I'm one of the pastors here at Harbor Trinity. Welcome back. For those of you who joined us for Easter or for Extravaganza, happy Sunday to everybody today. If you have a Bible, go ahead and open up to 1 Peter chapter 4. As we'll be at today, 1 Peter chapter 4. If you don't own a Bible, we have one in the seat in front of you. That's our gift to you. Feel free to take that with you and keep it, but we'll be turning to page 1016. At the earliest part of this year, we began walking through the book of 1 Peter. It's one of the first letters that Peter wrote to a group of churches. One of the things that we've been doing each and every week as we've walked through it is we've shared from Hebrews chapter 4. It's our conviction about this aspect of our service. It's our conviction about the Bible, and it just says that the Word of God is living and active. So our belief about the Bible is it's not just ancient truths or it's not just good ideas, but this is living and active and God speaks to it. It's sharper than any two-edged sword. And what that means is the Bible has this way of piercing through the division of our soul and spirit, joint and marrow. It gets to the very depths of who we are. And I just love this last line because it can discern the thoughts and intentions of our heart. And so our hope in our time together is we won't just have a bunch of time talking, or you won't just be listening to me gab for a long bit, but there will be a way that God speaks through his word today that allows all of us to be sharpened, to be equipped for everything that God has for us. And as we've walked through this series, a lot of the questions that we've been asking as you look at the world or as you see the things that are happening in the world, maybe you ask, what is my place in that? Where is God at in that? What is God doing in the world? How is God making things right? When is God going to redeem the things that have been wrong? And what are we to do in light of all of that? And this is a lot of the questions that Peter was addressing as he wrote to this group of churches. And it's our hope that we find kind of week over week. And so if you're new to Jesus Church in the Bible, here's just a brief summary both of this book and of Peter himself. And so Peter was one of the first followers of Jesus. He was one of Jesus' closest friends. And as he wrote this letter, he was writing it to a group of churches that were in Asia Minor, so kind of the northwest portion of that. It's between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. And they had been scattered from Jerusalem and had started to experience a number of things from the Roman Empire or from other people. And so there's this disheartening effect that starts to happen. And so Peter, to encourage them, started to say, here's what we know about Jesus. Here's what Jesus has done. Here's what we understand what God started to say in the Old Testament. And here's why that matters to us. And so as he's writing all of these things, one of the greatest parts that hangs over this, it's what we kind of keep saying each and every week, is that hope is one of the essential characteristics of a Christian, because not only do we look ahead to what God has in store for us, but there's reasons for us to be full of hope today. And you may look around and say, Justin, you clearly have not been watching the news. And I want you to know I kind of have-ish. But in all of that, to say that despite whatever the news headlines may be, or despite whatever the disposition of our heart may be, there is a reason for you and I to have hope. And so again, we'll start in 1 Peter chapter 4. We're going to read verses 1 to 6, and here they are. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is in the past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they're surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. And we believe that this is the word of the Lord. And I recognize that you'll forget the majority of what I say today, especially even after Shane mentioned that there's breakfast burritos after service. But having forgotten all of that, here's the one thing I'd love for you to remember. We'll put it on the screen for you. And the one thing is this: to make the most of the rest, however much it is. Make the most of the rest, however much it is. And as we get ready to jump into it, let's take a moment to pray. Jesus, thanks so much for today. And God, even for today where there's a fresh breath in our lungs and a fresh day for us to begin, and even for all of us in California, we're so surprised whenever it rains and how much we need the rain, and even what that symbolizes for us here in spring, that new life is beginning. And God, would you help us to see that Easter wasn't just a moment last weekend, but we continue to live in Easter, and the new life that Jesus promised has not only begun in us, but is continuing to be revealed in us. And would you help us to see even more of it? It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. One of the best exercises that you and I could ever do is to take a survey of how we spend our time. One of the things I love about new technology is that it'll tell you what you're doing on your phone with screen time. And then sometimes if you look at it, you're just like, I can't believe I did that. Like how many times you pick your phone up, like, oh, or how much you look at this or look at that. And so there's this part where you go, oh, this is really awesome. And then there's another part where you go, oh, I don't like that at all. Recently, the U.S. Labor kind of released this part that shows how does the average American spend their time. And it's a fun little graph that goes on the screen. You won't be able to read any of it because the text is really small. But there's this big bar that says, here's 24 hours a day, and here's how the average person spends it. And so some people love stats. Some of you go, it's 9:24 in the morning. This is my cue for a nap. Hold with me. So 9.84 hours every day are spent in personal care activities. Sleeping is included in that. 5.15 hours per day are spent with leisure and sports activities. 2.67 of those hours are spent watching TV or streaming things. 3.56 hours per day are spent working and in working-related activities. You're like, what kind of job does that person have? This also includes people who have retired or people who are unemployed. For active employees, it's 8.13 hours at work. 1.92 hours are spent with household activities. 1.2 hours per day are spent eating and drinking. 0.67 hours are spent with care work. 0.66 hours on purchasing goods and services. 0.39 hours per day in educational activities. 0.24 hours per day with organizational, civic, and religious activities. 0.16 hours per day with telephone calls, mail, and email. And then everything else gets in the file of 0.21 hours per day. Now, I loved some of the distinctions that you can see what ages do what genders do what, how people spend their times. But it was just this fascinating thing to say, all right, so if you had 24 hours and you could think about that, how are you going to spend your 24 hours tomorrow? And if you just were tracking it on a little notepad, I bet that you would come to the end of it and go, oh, I don't like how I spent that. One of the ways that we begin Alpha, this course that we lead that helps ask questions about faith and life's biggest questions, one of the ways that begin is they say, if you live to be the age of 70, which is my goal year, I don't know. Every time I talk about growing older, 70 is the year I use. If you're over 70, that's not an offense. I just think it would be awesome to make it there. So 70 is this one that I think, here we go. That's the one that I like. So here's to 70. If you live to be 70, you'll spend 20 years and 3 months asleep. You will spend 10 years and 5 months watching TV. Oh. You will spend 5 years and 9 months in some form of transportation, and you will spend 7 years and 6 months eating and drinking. You have approximately 570,000 hours to live up to, 70. And so the question they ask is, why not spend 24 of them asking life's biggest questions? And even when I see that big banner, I'm like, wow. That is something even about time, like 7 years eating of 70. You're like, man. So then here's my 70 years and here's my life. A recent tradition we began at Harbor Trinity, which is why Shane helped me out. I didn't know he was going to help me, but it was very much appreciated, is we give these little child dedication jars. And one of these, it's called a legacy marble collection. You can find it if you want to. But one of the things that this jars does is it helps every parent get perspective about how much time they have with their kids. So you have, if you're a parent, you have approximately 936 weeks from the time your child is born to the time that they graduate from high school. And so if you were to imagine that this little jar is like you holding the very beginning of your child's life, the statement that they make is they say, when you see how much time you have left, you have a tendency to do more with what you have now. And so to say that I did this exercise for all my kids. I began with this jar with every one of my little babies. And so then let's have some fun and let's do a little Chandler show and tell. We can put the picture on the screen if you want to see my squad, if you haven't seen them yet. So this would be an example of like my daughter, Hope. She's 4, and this is an estimate. I didn't count, 200 something little marbles. That did not have the time for that for today. But to imagine Hope just turned 4, and already from the time that we began this jar to right there is all of the weeks that have been that we've had with Hope. Then you've got her next little brother is Cohen, or her big brother, I guess, and he's 7. But look at all the time that's gone since he was 7. And if you're a parent, this is going to start to get really hurt and get terrifying. This is our middle son, Micah. He's 11 years old. These are the weeks that we have left until Micah graduates. He's going to graduate from 6th grade this year. And then the heavy one, our baby, Jude, he's getting ready to go into high school, and those are the weeks that we have left until he graduates from high school. So when you start to see that, it terrifies me internally. because I'm like, in this amount of time, he's leaving. And we start to think of, man, how soon until he starts to drive? How soon until he has to register to vote and enroll in the draft? And you're like, oh, like it starts to get really big. But if you have perspective that I have this many weeks with Jude, it's going to cause me to say, so what am I going to do with those weeks that are left? And it really helps you as a parent if you know you got that many. If you started here and you thought, look at all of the jar that I've wasted, because I didn't think about this down to here. Like, yeah, you may have a part where you go, I didn't want to spend it like that. But every one of us, regardless how you may feel about the marbles, every one of us can say there are some weeks left, so we can do more with what we have left than what we've lost, simply because we have the perspective of here's what now is left. And so in the case of Jude, we've got about 214 weeks left. With Micah, we've got 319 weeks left. With Cohen, we've got 580 weeks left. And with Hope, we've got 736 weeks left. And that's where we start to release them into the world and they get to, kind of go do their own thing. So one of the ways that we just even want to encapsulate our time together today is that we can make the most of the rest, however much it is. And the reality for you and I is I'm convinced I'm going to make it to 70. Somehow in my mind, I'm the one who believes that. But every one of us knows a 41-year-old dad who had multiple children who didn't, right? And that's not to be doomsday. You're going, ooh, it's none of that. Every one of us knows that story. But I'm convinced I'm getting to 70. And what I'll do is I'll start to say, well, I got more time, or I could do this. I'll start to say, since there's more time left, I don't have to worry about it right now. And one of the things that Peter starts to introduce is to say, hey, however much you have, make the most of the time that you have. And if we recognize how much time we have left, we'll do more with what we have now. So here's the first two verses. Here's kind of the way that it encapsulates this. It says, since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. One of the realities about Easter Sunday, even a week ago, is it's not everything that we understand about Jesus happened on that one day. That one day was the beginning, and there's 40 days total of Jesus appearing to his disciples and showing that he's alive in all of these different instances. So if you and I were amongst the disciples, it's not that we would have seen everything. We just would have started to hear the rumors that he's alive, or we would have heard someone had gone to the tomb, or we would have run to the tomb and see that it was open, and we would have thought that someone stole him. So we're still living in the space of maybe we've seen him, maybe we haven't seen him yet, but we're starting to hear that he's not there anymore. And then from now until this year, it's on Thursday, May 29th. That would be the day where Jesus ascended into heaven, following those 40 days of him proving himself alive to everybody. So one of the things that Peter does is he brings this reflection from Good Friday and saying, hey, since Jesus suffered in the flesh, since he hung himself upon the cross, since he did this to put to death everything that was keeping us away from God, since he did that, I want you to arm yourself in a very military style way of thinking. I want you to arm yourself and think of life in the same way that Jesus thought about it. That I want you to think about all the things that have been keeping you from God, and then knowing that that was true, arm yourself thinking, man, here's what Jesus did for me, so now here's how I'm going to live in light of that. That it's almost like you have to make your mind remember, this is what I need to do because of what he's done. And as much as sin can have this really negative religious connotation, and maybe you sat in a space where someone just kept hammering sin all the time, sin is one of these words that just helps us understand, what do we make of the gap between us and God? This thing that we feel in our souls, why is there a distance between us and God, and who created it? And ultimately, all of the distance between us and God is because you and I decided that we thought better than God did about any number of things. And the moment we started to decide and say, I know better, then we started to move ourselves away. And every time I've put myself in charge of my life, I haven't done the best job. I've done a good job. I've done some good things and some nice things, but there's plenty of moments where I've made a mess of stuff. And so when God says, so here's this mess, and what are you going to make of it? God himself loved us so much that he would die in our place to help resolve the mess that we created. It's like you as a parent looking in the living room and seeing all of the toys that are scattered about, and it's absolutely disgusting. Your kids did all this, and now they're covered in all of the powders and things, and you're like, I am going to make myself as you so that you don't have to deal with any of these. Now, every one of you as a parent is like, I am not doing that. But think of how much God loved you and I, that he didn't see the mess and say, you better pick it up. He didn't see the mess and say, you created it, now you got to fix it. He entered into it so that you and I would no longer have to bear the weight of that distance. And he says, so arm yourself with this way of thinking. Think like Jesus. And then he just says it very plain, like, hey, stop sinning, which is what the Bible says all the time. And there's these really wonderful passages of Jesus interacting with people and they shouldn't have been there. And he's like, hey, I love you, I forgive you, go stop sinning. And he literally says that to everybody. And it's that part where you're like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then to anyone who's ever tried, you're like, yeah, but that's actually kind of hard. Because it's like hardwired into who we've become as people. And so he says, if you arm yourself and think like Jesus, and then you stop sinning, now make the most of the rest of your life, not messing with that stuff anymore. When you see how much you have left, you have a tendency to do more with the time you have now. Knowing we have as much time as we have, it influences the decisions we're going to make today. If you knew this was going to be the end of your life and how many marbles you had, you'd probably start making some different decisions today. If you've ever experienced anybody who's gotten a diagnosis and someone started to put a clock or a ticking clock, it changes perspective. But every one of us, regardless of how we entered into the room today, the clock is counting down. And so what are we going to do with the time that we have left, however much it may be? And why would we make the most of the rest, however much it is? Because Peter says it's for the will of God. And some people would be like, hey, so what is the will of God? Or how should, like, this is the way that we live the will of God too. Is to say, here's what God has done. Here's what God is doing in the world. This prayer, not my will, but yours be done. I'm going to find myself living in the will of God. And he says this in verse 3, knowing of this of time, right? Whatever time in the flesh, no longer passions, but for the will of God. Here's what verse 3 says. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. And the fact that I've said orgies 3 times, some of you are like, church just got wild, right? This is the way that we keep going through this. So one of the things that Peter starts to bring up is he uses this phrase Gentiles because it wasn't just a description of people, it was a way of living outside of faith. And it wasn't meant to be a negative connotation. It's just like, this group of people lives like this. We're calling you to live in this different kind of way. And he says, so here's the things like, what did the Gentiles do? What would have been descriptive of a way that a person lives apart from God? The first would have been sensuality, which is this like unashamed indecency, or this insolent defiance. It's almost like the picture they're painting is if you just want to sin in broad daylight. You just want to do the wrong thing and you want everybody to know you're doing the wrong thing and just say, hey, whole world, here's what I'm doing. Passions would be the next one, and this burning like thing in your chest, this strong desire to have something that ultimately belongs to somebody else, but to say, this thing that I want, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get it. This is ultimately what passions mean. Drunkenness doesn't take a lot for us to understand because a lot of that we still describe today, but it's just this overly indulgent, large consumption of alcohol. Orgies, being in the same way, would be this unrestrained indulgence in sexuality. So the passions of food and drink, the passions of sexuality, this overly indulgent, unrestrained lifestyle to those 2 things, he's like, that's one of those descriptions. Drinking parties, you're like, so how is that different and distinct from drunkenness? Isn't that the way that we do it? But it's this unrestrained, again, kind of the pursuit of socially, we're all going to do this together. And then lawless idolatry is the last one, to worship anything that man made in the place of what God deserves. And so one of the things that I find fascinating is this is 2,000 years ago where this is written, and there's not that much about humanity or the planet that's changed. That you could hear those things and you could look at that list and you're like, yep, still going on. And there's all kinds of things and all kinds of ways that we can see it and be exposed to it. But one of the things that I love is he says, so hey, with the time that you have left, you had enough time to do all that other stuff. So let's put it to death. The contrast between who I was before I met Jesus and who I've become since I've met Jesus helps me to see the contrast in these 2 ways of life. And he starts to say, when you see kind of the juxtaposition, when you start to see the gap, you're going to have to make a decision about what am I to do with that. And he says this in verses 4-6. He says, with respect to this, so the things he just mentioned are all the things that everybody does, that they're surprised when you don't join in the same flood of debauchery and they malign you, but they'll give account to him who's already ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached, even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way that God does. one of the most surprising statements you'll ever make to your friends is when there's something that you've done for a long time and you're like, I'm not doing that anymore. And you could start to have that around a diet, right? Like you've ate all these different kind of things and they're like, hey, let's go have that. And you're like, I'm just not doing that anymore. And if it's so familiar to you, like, what are you talking about? Like you've been the person who's always been wanting to go and now you don't want to go. That part starts to be there. You could say, I'm not going out and I'm not doing that right now. Right? If you've ever said like, hey, we got to lock it up in our budget a little bit, so we're not going to be doing all these things. The moment you say we're not doing that, people are like, what are you talking about? So whether it's eating, going out, doing any sort of things, the moment you make that statement, it starts to be different for everybody else. And they start to ask questions. And he starts to say, with respect to this, people are surprised when you don't join in anymore because everybody's doing it. And now all of a sudden, you're not. When I became a Christian in high school, our family had moved back to Colorado in 6th grade. And so the friends that I had were people that I'd known, some of them since even kindergarten. And then as I moved back, we became friends again. And a lot changes over a series of years. But as I started, essentially I'd had the same group of friends from 6th grade up until 10th grade. And when I became a Christian in 10th grade, there were a lot of things that I was like, hey, I can't do that anymore. So a lot of the parties that I used to go to, don't go to the parties anymore. The people that I was hanging around with, not hanging around with those people anymore. I can remember that even like the music I was listening to, I found that it was impacting my ears in a different way. And it's even now, like some of my kids will be like, Dad, what's some of the music that you listened to when you were a kid? I was like, I don't think I'm playing that for you. They're like, oh, but it's like a learning opportunity. I was like, I know what you're doing, you trickster, right? But it's this part of saying, I hear it now and I hear it in a different way. As fun it is and as memorable it is, I can remember having the old CD cases, and I had one that was, the 4x4, and it just had so many CDs in it. And this was for all the younger kids. You actually had to hold that to be able to have all of your music available. But I had the one in the thingy that does this. I don't even know what you call that, right? The sun visor. I had that, and then I just had this other anthology that I could pull out at any time. And I can remember I was done listening to it, so I just gave a friend of mine all of these CDs. And then I think like, man, that's like hundreds of dollars that I just went, here you go, pal. And I can remember having this moment where I was like, so I'm not doing all this stuff anymore. Like even some of the houses that I would go to with friends, I can remember walking in and seeing what they're doing is like, I'm not going to be here for this anymore. And one of the things that was really hard for me, this is just the honest moment, is going to church. Like my life had been so changed by Jesus. And then as I started to get around friends that I had been with a long time, I didn't feel at place or at ease with them because I wasn't doing what they were doing anymore. But I certainly didn't feel like I belonged at church yet. Because a lot of the ways that church people interacted, and a lot of the things that I interacted with, I was like, there was such a gap between those two things. And so I felt out of place in both environments. And I can remember entering into this like really lonely season of like, who am I supposed to hang out with? Because I don't know if I'm actually friends with those people. I don't know if I want to be friends with those people. And then I was like, and I'm no longer able to be friends in this sort of space. And just having these days where I'm like, man, what do I do now? I guess I'll go get a job or something. Like it just had really hard days. But very slowly it started to change. And I found myself, even the people that I would have, you walk into a room and you're like, I think I could be friends with them. The times where I'd walk into church and I'd be like, I don't see anybody like me here. Because I came from an overly like hip hop culture and I walked into a church that was very like skater kid. I was like, I don't think this is for me, right? And all of the different things that would happen. And Christian music at the time was not great. Like there was worship music, which is like church music that you would sing, and I'm like, I'm cool for that. But just what's the music you listen to like pass your time? And I can remember when someone was like, Justin, we got like a rap CD for you. And I was like, sick, right? So they gave it to me, and it's this guy, his name is Kirk Franklin. Kirk Franklin is not a rapper. He is a gospel artist. But they were like, listen, like Salt from Salt and Peppa became a Christian, and she raps at the beginning of this thing. And I was like, I love your heart in this moment. I really do. I love what you're trying to do. And so when you start to see the ways that it's going on now, one of the things that's so incredible is some of the best friendships of my life have been Christian friendships. And it's not because there's something better about Christian people inherently. I think the thing that makes it better is we have these marked moments where like we've experienced God and eternity together. And it just marks the friendship in a different way. The 4 best friends that I have in the world, we've been friends for over 20 years. We were in college together. We were roommates at college. We've been in each other's weddings. We've been there in the most difficult moments of life. It's this part for 2 decades. The majority of my life, I've been in friendships with them. And it starts to have this moment of, there will always be days when you get into this like everybody's doing it space, that when you say you're not going to, everyone's surprised when you choose to live a different way. But one of the realities of following Jesus is if it hasn't caused us to live in a different way, have we really experienced Jesus? Because he's so transformed our life that what we used to be and who we're becoming, that those feel like they're two separate things. And then Peter uses this phrase, he says like this flood of debauchery, right? This thing that's taken over the world, the way that you see all of this stuff going on the planet. Again, this is 2,000 years ago. And what's crazy is many of us would say like, man, it starts to feel like that's true today. And you know what every generation would say of the planet? Look at all the stuff that's going on, and can you believe that they're doing this? And I've never seen this before, and that never happened when I was growing up. They've been saying the same thing for 2,000 years. But he uses this phrase called the flood because if you'll remember from last week when we were talking, what is the thing that he said? Jesus, just in his salvation and just the way that God saved Noah because of Noah's faithfulness to do what God said, in the same way Jesus saves us through baptism. And we are saved by the flood, and baptism becomes this reflection that we laid a former thing to death and we're being raised to a new life in Jesus. And he says, so you are being saved from this flood that's taken over the planet. You are being saved from all of these behaviors. Baptism has saved you so that we don't continue to live in it, even if you're made fun because of it, even if there's these things that start to happen in your life. And one of the things that Paul says, which echoes this sentiment that Peter has, another New Testament author, he says this in Romans 6. He says, so you just consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Christ Jesus. That the mark of our life becomes that it's not just that this thing is hanging around, that I've literally put a certain way of life to death, and now I'm finding myself living in Christ Jesus. That I'm actually alive for the first time, and because I'm alive, I don't have to live like that anymore, right? This thing that when you see how much time you have left, you have a tendency to do more with the time that you have now. How do we make the most of the rest, no matter how much it would be? Today, just as Jesus overcomes death, hell, and the grave, you and I, we too have overcome. In another letter, Paul says this in Galatians 2. He says, I've been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. This is the way that we make the most of the time, right? This life that I now live, it's no longer Justin who's living, but it's Jesus living through me. And this life that I live by faith, and I live it for the Son of God who died and gave himself for me. This life that I'm now living, I'm doing it because he loved me. I have taken this way of life, and I put that on the cross with Jesus. I took this former way of doing things and this former way of living, and I put that to death. One of the realities is it doesn't mean that that stuff's not going to pop up from time to time. And this certainly isn't me as like the holiest person you've ever seen in your entire life saying, I have never struggled with stuff anymore, so you guys should learn to stop struggling. If you really did it like I did it, you would not be dealing with this. I can tell you, it's so fascinating to me, the different times where I feel like I've overcome something and just randomly circumstance will pop up, and I'm like, whoa, where did that come from? Like, I've been living like this, and all of a sudden, I didn't do that. I made this joke last week where I was like, I made this decision to start working out more with some friends of mine, and to have these times where it's like, all right, well, I'm not going to like eat chips and salsa at night anymore because I'm really going to send it, right? And so, but as you start to get it, you get far enough away that you're like, man, it almost feels like a distant past. And then something happens where you're like, I would smash some chips and salsa right now. You're like, where did that come from? 9 o'clock snack. Right? You start to feel that. I'm telling you, as you find yourself following Jesus, the earliest days, all of this stuff is still there, and it still pops up. And we get the choice to make, am I going to continue to live as I've always lived? Or I'm going to say that there's a brand new life that I've started to experience. And I found myself very early on saying sorry a lot, because old me just had this way of coming out all the time. And now I find that I'm more like who God has been calling me to or moving me towards than I was back there. Like, I can see the distance now in 20 years. I can see the way that I respond now. And even some of the ways that people would describe me, the craziest part about me living here is having been in California for 9 years. Everybody who knows me here has known the best version of me because I didn't grow up here. right? They don't have the like, oh, we know you from high school, right? We remember that part of you, or we saw what you did here. We know the circumstances. I don't drive by places and go, whew, like I remember what happened at that spot. Ooh, trying to forget that. Maybe I did forget that. Like there's times where I'm riding with friends of mine and we'll be going down Newport Boulevard and there's a stretch by the triangle and other stuff and they'll point out the window and be like, ooh, I remember what happened there. I do not remember what happened there. And then you'll just keep seeing what happens. Like, I don't have that context. And even having come to Harbor Trinity in the last 3 years, from the moment I arrived here, every one of you had seen me at the best that I had ever been in my life up until that point. So you don't get all the stuff that came before that. Ignorance is bliss for all of you, right? But I know that part of me. And I can tell you when I go back home and when I drive through my neighborhood, I can start to look and see some of the different places and know all the different things. I can hear certain songs. I can see different things on television. And I go, man, I can remember. But then I look at my life right now and I get to say, I don't know if I'm going to make it to 70. I sure hope so, because I've been saying that number for a long time. And if I make it to 70, I know here's the different things that will be true of my life with eating and sleeping and working and everything else. But to all the other margin of my life and of my time, I have a choice to make with what I'm going to do with it. And we have a tendency to make the most of the rest when we know however much we have. And I don't know how many days I got. But the compulsion of 1 Peter 4 is, with whatever time you have, make the most of it to live in the Spirit as God has raised you to brand new life. And imagine if you said, I don't know how many days I have, but every day I'm going to live believing it may be my last. How much better are all of your days going to be because of how you made the decision about every single one? But if you were to look at this and you were to say about my kids, if we had a child right now, I pulled out this fifth jar and someone was like, are you making an announcement today? No, right? Knock on that out, right? There's not a fifth Chandler. But imagine if there was. Woosah. All right. And to say from that kid's life, here's all of the weeks that I've got left. And imagine if I just put this somewhere in my house where I could start to see me just pulling a marble every single week. And going, that's one less. Every time I held that marble, I would be able to say, what did I make of this week? How did I do with my kids? I'm going to apologize a lot. I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. But imagine what every one of those marbles would mean. But then as I look at my 14-year-old today, there's going to be a moment where I'm going to tell you this is going to be true for every one of my kids. I'm going to look at him and I'm going to see that jar is mostly empty. That I've got as much time left with him as we've had with Hope in total. It starts to influence the way I think because, man, the 4 years have flown by with her. And then I start to look at Cohen and Micah, and they're essentially inverted with how much time we've lost and how much time we have left. And to say, for each one of my kids, that's what I've got. And then I get to let them go into the world. And then there is this part of me that starts to think that maybe there's an aspect of this that is true with my relationship with God too. That whatever my jar was, whenever it started, there's just little marbles being pulled away each and every week. And I got to believe, man, there's certain moments that God looks in and he's like, Justin, you have no idea what's coming this week. You have no idea how good this week is going to be. Or maybe there's ones that are like little black marbles in there and God's like, oh, that's going to be a really hard week. But you have no idea what it's going to mean on the other side of it because you've overcome, because you've trusted, because you've believed. Every one of you today has some measure of time left. Would you make the most of the life of faith to put to death this former way of living? Enough time has passed where we've messed around with all the dumb stuff that all of us could say, I'm ready to move on from that now. And having moved on, would we now experience the brand new, resurrected, and the fullness of life that Christ has for us?